I'm Alan Ross. I'm the managing editor of APC Technologies, and we are here at the NETA, the International Electrical Testing Association, their 2023 Power Tech Conference, doing interviews. My guest with me is the Director of Communications for APC Media, Rachel Linke. Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Alan. Would miss it.
We're just going to have an interesting time with all of these people, and tell me what you like best about these interviews.
The best part about these interviews, I feel like, is that it really brings about a lot of great thought leadership, and I really just love how you make everybody feel so comfortable, Alan. You really try to get people to just be comfortable and in their own skin, and then so much great information comes out of it. So
let's see if we made people in the next interview comfortable. Enjoy. My next guest is a friend and a brother, and this is going to be fun. Ben Lanz is the director of everything strategic at Corp. I know that's not your title, but that's what I called you. He is also one of the co-founders of PDI Squared, correct? And you're going to talk a little bit about that, because I just love the initials. I remember we were at dinner, and the PDI Squared came up. It was either PDI 2 or PDI Squared. And I love the PDI Squared. But anyway, Ben, thank you for being here. So the question I've got is, there's two of them. We're going to go on two tracks. One of them is talk about when you formed PDI Squared, who formed it, and why was it formed? What do you think is going to happen?
Sure. So while I was very supportive of building the organization to where it is today, the original group was a much smaller subset, and that was Dow and Borealis as material suppliers, and folks like Quanta who go and install overhead and underground. And they pitched it to a number of other companies that had expertise in different areas, with the idea being, when we go to visit with utilities and industrials alike, there's a lot of myth and there's a lot of let's say rules of thumb that people follow when they're making infrastructure investments, and usually it goes something like this: we thought about underground, but overhead's cheaper, so we went cheaper.
That's not a myth, that's a fallacy. I know it's true.
But what I'm saying, there's a whole set of myths tied to that. For example, if you're in a floodplain, well, water and cables don't mix, so you can't do that. And well, of course the answer is 4 feet below the surface of the ground, it's 100% condensing moisture, so they're always living in water or moisture for their entire life. So that's not a non-issue. But these myths get propagated, and there's a fallacy, and there's rules of thumb, which really are not helping the industry, because we want people to make informed infrastructure investment decisions. Really, we're agnostic as it relates to overhead versus underground. But in many cases, these rules of thumb come in and people say it's X number of cost higher to install overhead, so I'm not going to think about underground. And when the reality is the life cycle analysis of underground may make more sense in many more applications than people would first realize. So we're promoting making sound decisions based on the life cycle cost and giving people case studies so they can use to pattern how do people make those decisions and what parameters to include in the models that they're using to justify those costs.
So I have a son, daughter-in-law, and a grandbaby in California. I spent a good bit of time, Sarah and I, my wife, we spend time there. And one of the big things in California that we deal with is all of the weather-related things and fires. And, cabling is a big part of whether it's overground or whatever. But I understand there's a hunger within California utilities for that kind of information to make wise decisions. Talk a little bit about California utilities, what's going on there, and PDI Squared.
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons why utilities are strategically undergrounding assets, and that varies by corner of the country, just like you said. So California, it's the wildfires, but if I may mention, Florida, it's the hurricanes. And Wisconsin, they have the emerald ash borer and other trees. Even if they have a right-of-way where the trees are cut back, there's still 40, 50, 60-foot tall trees coming down and taking all the lines out, even if they have the trees trimmed. So there is a recognition that no matter where you go in the country, if you look at the NOAA website, you'll see that obviously through inflation, we now have something on the order of $20 billion plus storms per year.
Wow.
So,
I didn't realize that.
so California, they don't have the ice storms. Well, they're having some snowstorms right now, but they don't necessarily have the hurricanes, but they have the Santa Ana winds.
Oh, yeah.
And they have the fires. And you know, you look at, and there's even a term for this, the wildlife urban interface, the WUI they call it, the WUI. Some people call it the WUI.
Wildlife urban interface. WUI.
That's where people want to live. In fact, even after the fires, according to some of the websites or the organizations that track this, people are moving back into those areas in droves. In fact, the growth in population in the wildlife interface, the WUI, yes, that's why they call it that, right? But in that interface, the growth rate is higher than many other places in the country.
Really?
Which is interesting because in other parts of the country, you know that 30% of our population lives in the first county along the coasts.
I did not know that.
So you think about that. We want to live in harm's way. It's beautiful, you know, the oceans, the rivers, the mountains, but that's where the danger is. And historically, man has decided to live away from that, except maybe the pioneers, right?
Yeah.
We've lived closer to where safety is. But we've decided, I believe, as a society, that we're willing to somehow take that risk because it's a reasonable risk. But all of a sudden, with California, you have this large population that's living on that wildlife urban interface, and they are trying to figure out how best to manage that system. So California has a very interesting situation right now where they are taking counsel from the ratepayers and from the investor-owned utilities. Other utilities are getting into the mix, consultants, and they are looking for input because usually rate cases are on a 3-year cycle, about that time frame. They are talking right now about a 10-year opportunity to make a 10-year investment in particular, on underground, realizing that this is a societal benefit, that this is a long-term benefit, and that while the investment needs to happen now, they want to be able to stretch it out over a longer period of time so the impact isn't so great to the ratepayers.
Is it more cost effective from a testing and maintenance standpoint for undergrounding than overhead? Or is it about the same?
No, it's dramatically different.
Okay.
Overhead is, or underground, I'll say the positive, underground is 10 times more reliable on average than overhead. That's
Really?
10 times less call-outs. And people will immediately say, oh, but sometimes it takes a lot longer to find the fault. Well, that was our grandfather's grid. You know, there are these things called line sensors.
Yeah.
That some of them, there's a whole variety of very low cost to very technologically advanced. In fact, I think you had one of the companies on one of your sessions earlier this year, interviews Sentient Energy, that has some rather sophisticated sensors, but there's also all the way down to fault indicators, very simple devices that can triangulate where the fault is. And if you have a crew who is trained to isolate and locate, you're talking about driving almost a minivan out there instead of one of these large bucket trucks, and at 10 times the rate, right? Remember, 10 times fewer times, you're going to be driving almost a minivan out there to fix this issue, as opposed to, the 10 times higher rate with the larger equipment. And if you think about how that relates to the costs, operating and maintenance costs, some investor-owned utilities have a capital to O&M ratio that penalizes them because of their at the P&L and the stock price.
Right.
In some utilities, it's 5x or 10x, so they can spend 5 to 10x more on capital instead of the O&M and have the same impact on their stock price. So if you think about that from that lens, utilities want to invest in using capital to remove future O&M. So if you have a solution, albeit more expensive, that has a 5-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio on a stock price, all of a sudden that gets them excited that they can now remove that future O&M and lower their operating costs.
No, that's excellent. I hadn't thought about that. as a case for underground. But it is like anything. It's the total cost of ownership over the life of that.
Right.
And too much is made of make it, the whole DER thing is we've been through the problem with making it cheap and suffering the consequences of not doing it right. When whether it's a solar plant or whether it's wind, if we had all of the gassing of transformers in wind because they were buying $13,000 transformers instead of $16,000. They saved $3,000. But now you got a gassing transformer that is significantly more costly to replace. Anyway, it's bad decisions and myths, as you say.
Well, and it's a lack of information.
Yeah.
So PDI Squared is all about information. Anything that we produce from our research, any case studies that we document from advising utilities, we make that open to the public because we want people to make their own decisions, but based on solid information and not something that's a myth or a rule of thumb that was made on our grandfather's grid and perhaps a siloed group of individuals.
Yeah, that's excellent. So what is your exact role with PDI Squared?
Well, I'm the immediate past chair, which means I just spent the last 2 years, and we have we went from a small organization to a slightly larger. We doubled in size, right? Okay. So we're growing, and most of our growth, at least visible growth, has been in the vendor space. So the consultants, the material suppliers, the folks that know how to dig in the ground, so they have large equipment that can directionally bore at very high rates, the folks that have line sensors. So we're building this consortium of folks who know how to get it done using the latest technology, and even some forward-thinking technologies like something as exciting as using plasma torches to cut holes in rocks and accelerate trenching even in the most difficult situations.
Excellent.
So some really forward-thinking ideas, but also some activities where it's just knowing how to do things at scale. For example, some of the utilities that are building out, I think Dominion just announced that they hit 1,800 miles of undergrounding. We Energies, or WEC Energy Group, has installed 2,000 miles. PG&E is saying that they're going to install around 10,000. I think they've cut it back a little bit, but the reality is thousands of miles. And Florida Power and Light says 27,000 miles. And,
wow.
And so there is a trend of in certain areas where people see that all of the benefits are lining up. For example, with FPL, they see the gross domestic product of the state as part of the equation.
Wow.
And when you start thinking it from a societal standpoint, all of a sudden the calculus changes, right? So when all of these line up, you're seeing some utilities really jump on it in a big way because it's solving a society challenge, right? But so it's really bigger than the utility. It's more of we as a society have to decide, are we going to live in these dangerous places to live? And are we going to deal with the climate as it is, the weather as it is, and tolerate long outages as it relates to our electric grid? And are we going to be able to have consistent investment in the grid, or are we going to have these spikes? We're going to be coming back to our ratepayers every 3 years saying, oh, we just had another big storm, we got to replace all of these poles. And then the gross domestic product, that's actually tax revenue. That's tax-based, right? So all of a sudden, it's not just the regulated body, it's the legislator saying, in fact, Dominion did this. They went and got a rider on a bill that's paying for their undergrounding because they said this helps everybody.
Wow, that's really good. That's excellent.
I would say what's exciting about this movement and this trend is people are seeing infrastructure investment as a societal benefit, not just we want to work with this specific utility in this specific environment. It's not a for-profit business scenario. There's a larger societal benefit angle to the whole conversation.
So the next time we're together, I'm going to ask you about all of that as it relates to resilience and reliability. But our time's up. Ben, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. Good to see you
again.
Good to see you again.